Hello. As I am making this, the art for Volt on the Electromagnetic Planet, Part 1 is nearing completion. Pretty soon it will be done, and then after that, the VN game dev will be done, and then it'll be done. Hopefully sometime this month. Until then, here's one last short one to tide you over. Here in front of you now is a stock photo of a human eye. You are likely using your own to see this video and this image. Here's a better look at those complex human eyes. This cross-section shows all the amazing bits, like the lens that focuses the light, the protective outer layers, the back with its light-sensing cells, which your brain is, right now, using to turn a blob of sensory stimulus into information. Only, this isn't your eyeball. For those with some knowledge of biology, there is actually something missing, which itself makes things missing in our normal field of vision. The blind spot. The area right here, where the nerves enter into our eye. Here, this should make things easier to see. This eye over here is actually the one you're using two of, hopefully, right now. Here's that missing spot where the light-sensing cells are, well, missing. Where our optic nerve comes in. So in that case, Argenbolt, what is this? Whose eye is this? A primate? A gorilla or a monkey? Nope. It's actually the eye of a squid. An animal so alien in its form, it's used time and time again to just be that. Aliens. But how could this be? Besides the obvious blind spot right here, how did our bipedal, naked, upright, sweating ape get something just like the hydrojet tentacled cephalopod? Well, as the title should help you guess, parallel evolution. Or more honestly and specifically, convergent evolution. When two different systems reach towards the same point, possibly even coming from a common ancestor. So today, that is what I want to talk to you about. The parallel evolution of what else but giant science fiction humanoid machines. How they evolved, how art evolves, how Mecha evolves, and how this beautiful boy here and this beautiful boy here are more closely related than you think. Now the best thing to get out of the way is the underlying question: can art evolve? After all, art is not a form of life. It's really a complex form of human culture. One that takes many different shapes. From woven tapestries to humongous land art, from video games and anime to ancient Babylonian hymns. Art has been with us for a very long time. I would argue, while not like traditional forms of life, what art most definitely is like is a virus of the mind. It infects us, and like a virus, it lets its host create more of it. We let it shape what we consume and reproduce. Even if it, on its own, is dead, within the human host, it lives. But even more nuanced, art also has the capacity for selective evolutionary pressures. Even before capitalism and the hyper-competitive marketplace of ideas, art had to mean something to people for it to be reproduced. Religious statues had to mean something strongly enough for a human to spend hours carving them. Like very real viruses, human art and its ideas could also hop hosts from one human culture to another. Maybe you find that Son of God really cool and his self-sacrifice for humanity really noble, right? So of course you know where he ended up in death. Jerusalem? The Vatican? Salt Lake City? Heaven? Goodness no. Shingo, Japan, of course. They have the Legend of Christ Museum and the Grave of Jesus. After all, in his lost years, he went to Japan and learned Japanese. Only then went back to the Holy Land, swapped places with his poor identical brother Isukuri, who was crucified in his place, and then sailed to Japan where he died at the age of 106. As everyone already knows, I won't bore you with the details about the hidden pyramid or the yogurt factory. The point is, information clearly has many lifelike properties. Amongst them, as I mentioned, selective pressures and the ability to reproduce across vast distances. Franchises want to carry on financially. Artists want to be able to keep making art. It all acts as a form of almost parasitic reproduction. New forms of art, like new forms of life, can catch the public's imagination and create both new desires, but also tap into old feelings. And as one final strong parallel, like a virus, art can freely integrate and swap DNA with its hosts. Honestly, at very astonishing rates. So today, that is what I'm going to do. Tell you the story of one of those parallels, and trace back the common ancestry of just that. Within the domain of writing is the kingdom of fiction. Within that is the larger phylum, science fiction, within which is the specific order we are looking at today, vehicular science fiction, and its family, Mecha. The two genus we will be looking at are, of course, Western Mecha and Eastern Mecha. These are the two species in question, Cosmopugnatori Inferno Divini and Armaticori rubiconus. At first glance, these two species seem worlds apart. First of all, their sizes are wildly different. The eastern species reaches 10 meters and the western one only around the size of a human. The eastern species here is capable of flight and can wield a large complement of weapons as well. The western, more sedentary species is slower and far more vulnerable. Could these two really divergent species, in fact, share a deep and nuanced history? And by showing their ancestry, can I show you just how actually deeply related they really are? The earliest ancestor we must look at and mention is Nucleopugnatori americanus. Now what is amazing is this species not only existed in the real world, it was part of an entirely different kingdom, not fiction, but non-fiction, in the phylum Military Doctrine booklets. As I went over in the On Gundam 0079 video, this species is notable for a combination of several big ideas and features. Its environment was supposed to be a nuclear battlefield, so to deal with this it emphasized distributed formations, fast movement over terrain, long-range communications, and heavy firepower. Sadly, Nucleopugnatori as a species was not only not long-lived, dying out in the real world after less than a decade, the nuclear battlefields it was meant to inhabit, its ecosystem, also thankfully never came about. But its mental image was compelling and infectious, and for art, those are some of the mandatory conditions to live on. As I also mentioned earlier, the life form of art is a very free one to jump quite dramatically in its DNA. This happened here, when, just shortly afterwards, back in our familiar phylum of science fiction, a new species would form which is perhaps the actual earliest common ancestor, Cosmopugnatori heinleini. This took many of the appealing features of Nucleopugnatori and enhanced them. Now, the nuclear power sources were within the very body of the machine. It was also armed with nuclear weapons, and had a jetpack, which is cool, which it used to move around quickly. To say Cosmopugnatori heinleini was a successful form of art as an organism is an understatement. Some of the most defining imagery of the phylum of science fiction became offshoots of this very species. Armored space fighting suits on alien worlds. Beyond that, Cosmopugnatori haloi, Cosmopugnatori imperius as well, would see it jump to the domain of video games and painted miniatures, and be very popular. The domain of comics would have Homoferus starkae, and in the domain of film, Homoferus downae, become staples. Returning to our central point though, Cosmopugnatori heinleini, and its more broad species of Cosmopugnatori chalybgorillae, would spawn the entire genus of Cosmopugnatori, which is now a fundamental one to our conception of fighting soldiers in space. But something interesting was happening in the 1970s. After the American occupation of Japan at the end of World War II was carried on, Americans brought over many invasive species of art with them. Perhaps one of the most famous examples would be Phrixum gallus colonelis, who now survives in arguably a healthier population in Japan than America. But more relevant to us is that our beloved genus, Cosmopugnatori, would also see its own jumping over the Japanese consumption of science fiction, specifically with the efforts of two Japanese artists, Naoyuki Kado and Miyatake Kazutaka. They would create Cosmopugnatori japonicum. This new species would have a profound effect. In truth, these two species really make up the two main points of origin from our last common ancestor. From here, I will show the lineage of Cosmopugnatori japonicum first, then show how Cosmopugnatori heinleini developed. From Japonicum, we quickly arrive at another very definitely successful genus which descended quickly. You probably already know, thanks to Kunio Okawara, that Cosmopugnator okawarai, known by its more commonly used name, Gundamus septemnovae, or really, Gundamus gundami, is the origin of the still very popular and growing, wildly successful genus of Gundamus. This blended the earlier Bazengarai, Getorforma, and Cinque Potentia trends with the gritty realism of the domain of post-World War II realist war cinema. Its gun cannon and Zaku species in particular are potently still filled with much of the DNA of the war vehicle, the Cosmopugnator. Shortly after, the Gundamus genus radically altered and outcompeted most of the previous mecha species, and had a very large impact, becoming still to this day arguably the apex predator of the entire family of Eastern mecha, only recently slightly challenged by Neoseculum Evangelium. But to get to the really important members, we also need to mention Takahashi Solaridentum, with its effects that will come up later, and the very related Takahashi Lentium Canis, for the impact as well. And of course, really should be mentioned, Kawamorai Variabilis Felix, from Across as another impactful genus-defining group. Really, the reason I mentioned all of these from the domain of animation is because we can now return to the domain of video games and the coalescence of much of this into a singular species, which is half of our final parallel evolution. Cosmopugnatori armaticore, or, as it was the first of a new and ongoing genus of many species and subspecies, Armaticore armaticore. This group would feature many recurring traits which I still one day hope to do an in-depth cataloging of. Armaticore would be notable for many fast generations of rapid evolution, showing its mutations to be dynamic and varied. Interestingly to us, it would at times feature designs from both Kawamori and even Kazutaka Miyazaki, the source of the original Cosmopugnatore japonicum. With this lens, we can actually see much of that original DNA still in it. The nuclear reactor being a selectable part we choose, the myriad weapons equipped onto the machine. The very fact, much like Cosmopugnatore Chalupgorelai, Armaticore has the armor of that original power armor right in its title. Its more fantastical elements, like freedom of flight and rapid movement, are here evolved traits that came from that original DNA, and in their own way are very indicative of the very dramatic environment of the Japanese imagination, especially when it comes to vehicular science fiction. In comparison to the US, the dense smaller island of Japan favors mobile and elegant mecha design, with a high emphasis on evasion and much higher metabolic rates. This is no doubt because of the defining role of the genus Gundamus in defining what species live and die, as any apex predator does. Armaticore martius, Armaticore corvus, and Armaticore durum planum would see a strong presence in the mental ecosystem of not only Japan, but also reverse migrating back to North America, where Cosmopugnatore originated, all while still retaining much of the speed which defined their origins. This actually now led famously to Armaticore Celeri velocitas, a species so fast it was actually too fast for the imaginations and abilities of the human hosts whose mind it inhabited. This led to, at one point, a dramatic population bottleneck around the time of its dominance. To this day, depending on who you ask, it is either an unchallenged apex predator or an evolutionary dead end, which in turn finally brings us to Armaticore cinques and Armaticore eudicium, which slowed the species and metabolism down for a more gritty combat, built around terrain and a more nimble use of cover. After this, it had seemed like Armaticore as a genus had functionally gone extinct. Many who enjoyed it sadly proposed that the environmental conditions had simply changed too much and its days were over. However, an unintentional miracle had happened. FromSoft, the same parent organism which is the source of Armaticore, also made another series, Umbras Animas Oculotus. This other species, while mostly unrelated, only sharing perhaps the harder carapaces and existing in a altogether completely different phylum of fantasy, did have another side effect. The Umbras genus kept the FromSoft organism alive long enough such that the incredibly long gestation period of the next Armaticore parasite was completed. So, after a very long wait, Armaticore rubiconus arrived. Thus, we too have a complete line of descent for one of our species. But after all, this is a video about parallel and convergent evolution, right? To end here would be half done at best. Thankfully, the other half of the story is not as long. After World War II, the dominant forms of media in the US and their domains of art would lean heavily towards live action. Even in regards to expensive science fiction, this would remain the same. We thus pick up the story of our other lineage with the arrival of a very visually impactful species, Cosmopugnatore verhovii. This species at first strikes us as an odd evolution in many ways. Much of the original DNA of Cosmopugnatore seems missing. Wears the powered armor with a nuclear generator and jetpacks. This diminutive species seems almost if not explicitly designed to make the humans in it more vulnerable, not less. Now, some would ascribe this simply down to the shift in tone towards satire on the part of the director, and others would have that the jingoistic militant humans dying to bugs would suit that also much better. Perhaps also the production cost of having possibly dozens of extras in expensive prop mech suits would be prohibitively expensive. These are valid lines of reasoning, but miss out on a larger environmental factor worth noting. That is simply the presence in North America and Western Europe of the families of Mecha of megafauna. Specifically the now massive genus of Bellemtechnica gargantopresi. Without question the largest species in North America when looking at overall population. It doesn't matter if it's the Great Plains, the Southwest, or the general scale. In general, in comparison to Japan, the US is bigger, and this genus in population is likewise. Perhaps because of this, we saw the proliferation of Bellemtechnica instead. These megafaunal species in their scope and number are huge, much like the once extant American bison herds. Slow and plodding, they share much DNA with the real-life war machines, with very limited and a robust feeling of motion. This would be somewhat ironic, as Bellemtechnica actually at its start absorbed much Eastern DNA, specifically from the Takahashi genus. But for comparison, only very briefly did Japan see a comparable species in Chaloblegio gargantoinstrumentum, and it went extinct just as fast, now being considered, if extant at all, a fossil species. What is important to us is the effect these megafauna had. Just as with our ancestors surviving under the feet of the terrifying giant lizards, for the western phylum of Mecha, this all but forced the descendants of Cosmopugnatore to undergo a shrinking in size, so as not to compete with Bellemtechnica in a direct ecological niche. Through this lens, I would then like to propose a new theory, that Japan's native phylum of eastern Mecha may in fact display a form of evolutionary island gigantism. That is, the effect whereby smaller species, isolated on islands, actually experience a large growth in size, as with the giant Minorcan rabbit, the gorilla lemur of Madagascar, or the still-alive moonrats. This would explain Gundamis's increase in size, as well as explain the native North American and Western Cosmopugnatore's dwarfism, as a response to the environmental pressure of their respective imaginations. With that in mind, we can now see how Cosmopugnatore verhovii arrived at its small stature, until at last we arrive at the other descendant in our example of parallel convergent evolution, Cosmopugnatore Inferno Divini. Despite not directly being of exactly direct descent, unlike the other various failed hopping into video game formats of that lineage, this species would nail it, seeing amazing success and proliferating in the imagination of humans. Now here I can imagine some people protesting and saying, but Inferno Divini already has a mech in it. Doesn't that one count? That's actually a mistake. The mech in Inferno Divini by default is actually a dwarf form of a Bellemtechnica design, and it moves with the apparent blockiness and clumsiness of that as well. With this, we can now return to where we started, the two species in question. Note now that despite seemingly dramatically different forms, they have many of the same features taxonomically. They are armored and sport a thick protective layer. Note the distinctive green coloration of the outer skin, an almost Zaku-like coloration. The way this thick armor is further enhanced with a shield, making it able to absorb large amounts of oncoming fire with ease. Traceable once again back to their common Cosmopugnatore ancestor. Notice the weapons as well. A varied assortment of machine guns with a large magazine, also usable with the shield, a backup explosive grenade launcher for a larger impact, even if sadly both still shy away from the nuclear output of their forefathers, and finally a large powerful energy weapon with a long charging time. Here some might ask, But what of mobility? While it is true Inferno Divini did lose much of the mobility which defined its Cosmopugnatore ancestry, it can still sacrifice its shield for at least the jetpack of its ancestors. And also worth noting as well, Rubiconus actually has a shared feature with Inferno Divini, which is also traceable to their ancestor in mobility: deployment from space via a drop pod. Though appearing only briefly in Rubiconus' case, still, it remains. Despite being made a world apart, and with limited direct sharing of DNA, the convergent evolution of Mecha produced these two eerily similar organisms of the mind. So today, I hope you enjoyed this short analysis of art, the mind, and the shared DNA. As you can see, things evolve quite a bit, yet retain many nuanced features unexpectedly. With that, the next video will be the final trailer for Volt, and soon after the release of my project. Get excited! It is, after all, the pivotal story of both aliens and humanity.